We are taught from childhood that the world outside is dangerous, and that our family is our ultimate safe harbor. We are told that no matter how harsh the storms of life become, the people who share our blood will always be the ones to shield us from the rain. But what happens when the very people who built your sanctuary are the ones quietly dismantling it brick by brick while you sleep? What if the face you trust more than any other in this world is merely a mask worn by someone waiting for the perfect moment to take everything you have ever worked for? This is the reality that a 52-year-old woman named Evelyn had to face on a cold Tuesday afternoon when a simple knock on her front door shattered the illusion of the life she thought she knew completely. She stood in her hallway holding a stack of unopened mail, completely unaware that the next 60 seconds would alter her existence forever. Two detectives stood on her porch, their expressions heavy with a gravity that made her breath catch in her throat. They didn't ask to come inside for a casual chat. They asked her to confirm her identity and then handed her a folder containing documents that defied all logic. As Evelyn turned the pages, her chest tightened because she was looking at signatures that bore her name, bank accounts she had never opened, and a staggering mountain of debt totaling over $300,000 tied directly to her Social Security number. The most terrifying part wasn't the money. It was the realization that the paper trail led directly back to her own household. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To truly understand how a devoted mother and respected community nurse could be blindsided so completely, we have to look back to the years preceding this moment. Evelyn had spent her entire adult life establishing a quiet, comfortable existence in a peaceful Ohio suburb, a place where neighbors still waved across manicured lawns and unlocked doors were a sign of community trust. She had raised her daughter, Chloe, with every ounce of love and resourcefulness she possessed, balancing long shifts at the local hospital with the demands of being a present, nurturing parent. For the longest time, their bond appeared unbreakable to anyone looking in from the outside. Chloe was Evelyn's pride and joy, a bright young woman who seemed destined for great things, though she often relied heavily on her mother's emotional and financial generosity. When Evelyn's younger brother, Richard, moved back into the area after a series of failed business ventures, Evelyn welcomed him with open arms, believing that family should always provide a soft landing place. Richard was charismatic, quick-witted, and possessed an innate ability to make people feel seen, which made him an instant favorite in the household. He assumed the role of the protective younger brother and the supportive uncle, helping around the house and offering to assist Evelyn with her complicated administrative tasks. Evelyn was managing a demanding schedule at the hospital, often working overnight shifts that left her physically exhausted and emotionally drained, creating a vulnerability she didn't realize existed. It was during these quiet late-night hours, while Evelyn was saving lives in the emergency room, that the foundation of her financial security began to erode. The deception did not begin with a massive, noticeable theft that would instantly trigger alarms. It began with small, imperceptible choices that were easily overlooked by a busy mind. Richard volunteered to manage the household mail and organize the monthly utility bills, claiming he wanted to alleviate the pressure on his sister's shoulders. This gesture appeared deeply compassionate, but it effectively created a barrier between Evelyn and her financial reality, allowing correspondence from banks to be intercepted before she ever saw it. At the same time, Chloe began expressing an interest in learning how to manage investments, prompting Evelyn to share access to her primary accounts under the guise of financial education. This open display of parental trust provided the final piece of information needed to execute a highly coordinated scheme from within the home. Within 6 months, new lines of credit were quietly established using Evelyn's pristine credit history, which had taken her 3 decades of meticulous budgeting to build. Credit cards were opened under major banking institutions, with the billing addresses instantly routed to a private digital post office box that Richard had established under a false business entity. Evelyn remained entirely unaware as balances on these hidden accounts began to climb, fueled by luxury purchases, cash advances, and secret bank transfers. The sophistication of the operation grew when Richard discovered that Evelyn's home equity could be leveraged for substantial cash loans without requiring her physical presence at a bank. By utilizing online notary services and manipulating digital identification protocols, A second mortgage was approved on the suburban property that Evelyn had paid off years prior. The funds from this massive loan were immediately transferred through a sequence of secondary accounts, making the trail incredibly complex to follow for an untrained eye. Meanwhile, Evelyn began noticing subtle changes in her daughter's lifestyle, such as expensive new clothing and frequent trips that Chloe claimed were funded by freelance digital marketing projects. Evelyn chose to celebrate her daughter's apparent success rather than question it, because doubting her own child was a concept her mind simply refused to entertain. When Evelyn occasionally mentioned that her debit card was declined at the grocery store, Richard was always there with a plausible explanation, attributing it to systemic bank errors or temporary fraud prevention holds. He would smoothly offer his own card to pay for the groceries, creating an illusion of dependency that made Evelyn feel immensely grateful for his presence in her life. This psychological manipulation ensured that whenever Evelyn felt a lingering doubt, she would immediately dismiss it as personal paranoia or fatigue from her grueling hospital shifts. The financial bleeding continued unabated for over 2 years, with the conspirators systematically draining Evelyn's retirement portfolio by executing unauthorized hardship withdrawals under her name. They forged her signature on legal documents with a chilling precision that indicated hours of practice, ensuring that every piece of paperwork looked entirely legitimate upon casual inspection. The turning point arrived when the accumulation of unpaid balances reached a critical mass, causing automated collections systems to bypass the hidden digital mailboxes entirely. Local couriers began attempting to deliver legal notices directly to the property, which forced Richard and Chloe to employ increasingly desperate measures to keep Evelyn isolated from the truth. They would intentionally volunteer to run errands during the times of day when delivery trucks typically frequented the neighborhood, ensuring they were the ones to meet the couriers at the driveway. On the rare occasions when Evelyn received a strange phone call from an unknown number, Chloe would gently take the phone away, claiming it was a persistent telemarketing scammer targeting healthcare workers. This protective bubble was maintained with an eerie calm, even as the financial structure supporting their entire lives was actively collapsing into absolute ruin. The arrival of the detectives on that fateful Tuesday afternoon finally pierced the veil of security that Evelyn had lived under for so long. The investigators revealed that an internal fraud unit at a major national bank had flagged a series of highly irregular balance transfers that originated from Evelyn's residential IP address. They had monitored the activity for weeks, building a comprehensive digital profile that definitively linked the fraudulent applications to devices operating within her own four walls. As Evelyn sat at her kitchen table absorbing the magnitude of the revelation, the pieces of the past 2 years began to fall into place with agonizing clarity. The missing mail, the sudden wealth of her daughter, and the constant reassurance from her brother were not signs of affection, but components of a trap. When Richard and Chloe returned to the house later that evening, they were met not by an exhausted nurse, but by law enforcement officers waiting in the living room. Chloe immediately broke down into tears, attempting to shift the entirety of the blame onto her uncle, claiming she had been manipulated into participating against her will. Richard, however, maintained a stoic, detached silence that was far more chilling than any confession, refusing to look his sister in the eye as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. The subsequent legal battle tore the remaining fabric of the family apart, as extended relatives took sides, often urging Evelyn to drop the charges to avoid public shame. Evelyn stood firm despite the immense emotional pressure, realizing that true justice required her to expose the betrayal completely, regardless of the painful consequences. The silence that settled over the house after the police cruisers drove away was louder than any scream Evelyn had ever heard in her life. She sat alone in the living room, staring at the walls of a home that no longer truly belonged to her, feeling like a stranger in her own skin. The realization that her own daughter, the child she had carried, nurtured, and sacrificed her youth to protect, had looked her in the eyes every single day while actively erasing her future was a pain that physical words could not adequately describe. Every memory of the past 2 years began to warp and distort in her mind, turning moments of shared laughter and family dinners into cold, calculated stages of a psychological operation. She realized that the people she loved hadn't just stolen her money. They had stolen her sanity, her peace of mind, and her ability to trust another human being for as long as she lived. The following morning, Evelyn bypassed her usual shift at the hospital and drove directly to the county courthouse to meet with the forensic accountant assigned to her case. The office was small, sterile, and flooded with harsh fluorescent light, a stark contrast to the warm home environment where the deception had taken place. The accountant, a methodical man named David, laid out 3 massive binders filled with bank statements, credit applications, and digital access logs that spanned over 24 months. He explained to Evelyn that financial crimes committed by family members are often the most devastating because the perpetrators possess intimate knowledge of the victim's routines, passwords, and emotional vulnerabilities. As David began tracking the flow of the stolen money, Evelyn watched in absolute horror as the true scale of the devastation was laid bare on the paper before her. The funds from the second mortgage had not been spent on a single, grand luxury or a desperate medical emergency, as she might have desperately hoped to comfort herself. Instead, the money had been systematically bled out through a series of digital payment applications and online gambling platforms that Richard had accessed using Evelyn's tablet. More heartbreakingly, a significant portion of the cash advances had been used to fund a lavish apartment lease in a trendy part of the neighboring city for Chloe, a place Evelyn didn't even know existed. Chloe had been living a double life, presenting herself as a struggling student to her mother while enjoying a premium lifestyle funded entirely by her mother's destruction. The documentation also revealed that Chloe had signed her mother's name on a vehicle lease for a luxury SUV, driving it past Evelyn's workplace without a single shred of remorse or fear of detection. As the state prosecution began preparing the formal indictment, detectives conducted separate, recorded interrogations of Richard and Chloe, stripping away the remaining defenses of the co-conspirators. The audio transcripts, which Evelyn's attorney later obtained, revealed a sickening level of casual entitlement from the 2 people she had trusted most. Richard initially attempted to shield himself by claiming that he was merely helping Evelyn manage assets that she was too mentally unstable to handle following her husband's passing. He painted a picture of an aging, incompetent sister who was losing her grip on reality, a narrative that made Evelyn's blood run cold when she heard it. When detectives presented Richard with physical security footage of him using Evelyn's debit card at an automated teller machine miles away while Evelyn was clocked into her hospital shift, his confident demeanor finally cracked. Chloe's interrogation was entirely different in execution, but equally devastating for Evelyn to witness through the cold lens of the investigation. The young woman wept hysterically, maintaining that her uncle had coerced her into signing the documents by promising that the money would eventually be used to buy Evelyn a beautiful retirement property. However, when investigators confronted Chloe with private text messages recovered from her phone, her tears instantly stopped and were replaced by a freezing indifference. The text messages between Chloe and Richard showed a calculated partnership, with Chloe actively advising her uncle on which days her mother would be too exhausted from consecutive night shifts to notice irregularities in the mail. In one particularly chilling exchange, Chloe wrote that her mother was too trusting for her own good and that they deserved the money more because they had their whole lives ahead of them. The grand jury wasted no time in returning indictments against both individuals, charging them with multiple felony counts of grand theft, identity fraud, and forgery. The news of the arrests sent shockwaves through their tight-knit Ohio community, turning Evelyn's private tragedy into public gossip overnight. Friends she had known for decades began treating her with a delicate, uncomfortable distance, unsure of what to say to a woman whose family had tried to ruin her. More painfully, extended family members from out of state began calling Evelyn, not to offer support, but to beg her to show mercy and rescind her cooperation with the state prosecutor. They argued that a public trial would permanently stain the family name and that Chloe's future would be completely destroyed if she were sent to a state penitentiary. Evelyn found herself facing a choice that no parent should ever have to contemplate: protect her child from the legal consequences of her actions, or protect herself from total financial and psychological ruin. The pressure was immense, causing her to lose sleep and weight as she walked the empty halls of her home, listening to the echoes of the life she used to have. But every time she felt her resolve weakening, she looked at the bank notices threatening foreclosure on the house she had worked 30 years to pay off. She realized that showing mercy would not heal her daughter, It would only validate the lie that her life and her labor were disposable assets for others to consume. She chose to stand firm, refusing to sign the non-cooperation agreements sent by her brother's defense attorney, signaling that she would see the process through to the absolute end. The trial took place in the middle of a bitter winter, matching the cold atmosphere that had completely taken over Evelyn's world. Taking the witness stand was the most difficult thing she had ever done, as she had to look directly at her daughter sitting at the defense table across the room. Chloe refused to meet her mother's gaze, staring intently at the wooden table while her defense attorney attempted to paint Evelyn as a vindictive parent who was exaggerating a family misunderstanding. Richard sat beside his attorney with the same detached, stoic expression he had worn since the day of his arrest, seemingly unbothered by the destruction he had caused. Evelyn took a deep breath, gripped the edges of the wooden podium, and delivered her testimony with a clear, steady voice that commanded the entire courtroom's attention. She detailed every shift she had worked, every dollar she had saved, and the absolute betrayal of discovering that her love had been used as a weapon against her. The prosecution presented the forensic financial trail, leaving no room for doubt or alternative explanations regarding who had executed the transactions and where the money had gone. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both Richard and Chloe, a definitive conclusion to a 2-year nightmare. During the sentencing hearing, the judge spoke directly to the defendants, expressing utter disgust at the lack of empathy they had shown toward a woman who had given them nothing but devotion. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in a maximum security facility, while Chloe received a 4-year sentence, bringing a legal end to the conflict but leaving the emotional wounds completely wide open. The closing of the prison doors did not bring the immediate sense of relief that Evelyn had anticipated during those long, agonizing months leading up to the trial. Instead, the silence of her new reality felt heavy, a constant reminder of the empty spaces left behind by the people who should have loved her the most. She spent her evenings in her modest apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes of rescued family photo albums, trying to reconcile the smiling faces in the pictures with the cold individuals who sat at the defense table. The financial institutions began the aggressive process of restructuring her remaining liabilities, a painful daily reminder that even though the perpetrators were punished, the victim was still left to pay the physical price of their greed. Evelyn adjusted to her new, frugal lifestyle, packing her own meals for her long hospital shifts and learning to navigate a world where her safety net had been completely vaporized. 6 months into her brother's prison sentence, Evelyn received a certified letter from the State Department of Corrections that would once again upend her understanding of the past. The letter was not an apology from Richard, nor was it a plea for forgiveness from her daughter Chloe. It was a formal notice regarding a safety deposit box that had been seized during the initial asset investigation. The box, registered under a fictitious business name that Richard had used, had been overlooked during the rapid chaos of the trial because it was located in a small community bank 3 counties away. Because the legal proceedings were officially concluded and the restitution orders remained largely unsatisfied, the state was preparing to liquidate the contents to compensate the defrauded banks. Evelyn was granted a brief window of time to inspect the contents to ensure that no irreplaceable personal items or sentimental family heirlooms were accidentally destroyed in the liquidation process. The following Monday, Evelyn drove through a blinding rainstorm to the small rural bank, her hands trembling on the steering wheel as the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her chest. She was escorted into a private, windowless viewing room by a bank manager and a state representative who placed a long, metallic box on the table before her. When the lid was lifted, Evelyn did not find stacks of hidden cash or expensive jewelry purchased with her stolen retirement funds. Instead, the box contained a thick stack of old, handwritten letters and a legal notebook belonging to her late husband, Thomas. Thomas had passed away 3 years prior to the arrest, and Evelyn had always believed his death was the tragic catalyst that allowed Richard and Chloe to begin their predatory financial behavior. As she opened the notebook and began reading her husband's familiar, precise handwriting, she realized with a sickening jolt that the deception had actually begun long before Thomas ever fell ill. The journal entries revealed that Thomas had discovered Richard embezzling small amounts of money from a shared family property venture nearly 5 years ago. Thomas had quietly confronted Richard, demanding that he repay the funds under the threat of legal exposure, which explained the sudden, intense animosity that had developed between the two men before Thomas's passing. More devastatingly, the notes detailed a heartbreaking conversation Thomas had overheard between Richard and a teenage Chloe in the backyard during a summer barbecue. Even at that young age, Chloe was being coached by her uncle to view her mother's hard-earned savings not as an inheritance to be respected, but as an underutilized resource that was rightfully theirs to claim. Thomas had spent the final months of his life quietly attempting to firewall their primary accounts, but his sudden illness had prevented him from completing the legal documents necessary to protect Evelyn permanently. The most chilling revelation was a hidden letter that Thomas had written directly to Evelyn, warning her explicitly about the financial patterns of her brother and the growing entitlement of their daughter. The letter had been placed in the desk drawer of Thomas's home office immediately following his passing, a drawer that Chloe had volunteered to clear out while Evelyn was sedated by grief. Chloe had intercepted her father's final warning, hiding it away in Richard's secret safety deposit box to ensure that her mother would remain entirely defenseless and beautifully oblivious to the plan already in motion. Sitting in that sterile bank room, Evelyn held the paper her husband had touched years ago, realizing that her daughter's betrayal wasn't a spontaneous mistake born of youthful ignorance or poor adult influences. It was a calculated, multi-year campaign that required Chloe to actively suppress her own father's dying wish to protect her mother from financial ruin. The discovery of the letter transformed Evelyn's grief into a profound, unshakable clarity that changed her approach to her ongoing recovery completely. She realized that she could no longer waste her emotional energy wondering what she could have done differently to save her relationship with her daughter. The betrayal was deeply systemic, woven into the fabric of characters that she had loved but could never truly change or fix through her own generosity. Evelyn declined to claim any remaining assets from the box, allowing the state to liquidate everything to satisfy the banks, officially severing her final material connection to the conspiracy. She returned to her apartment, placed the single letter from Thomas on her nightstand as a reminder of true love, and made a conscious decision to close the chapter of her life dedicated to family obligation. As the years marched on, Chloe made several attempts to contact her mother from the correctional facility, sending long, emotional letters filled with excuses and promises of reformation. Evelyn read each letter calmly, but she chose never to reply, understanding that true boundaries are not built out of anger, but out of a profound commitment to one's own peace. She focused her remaining years on her work at the hospital, eventually retiring with a modest pension that she guarded with absolute vigilance and independent legal oversight. She formed a new network of chosen family, trusted friends, colleagues, and community members who valued her for who she was, rather than what she could provide for them financially. Evelyn's home is smaller now, but it is filled with light, laughter, and an absolute certainty that no one in her inner circle is working in the shadows to cause her harm. The story of Evelyn, Richard, and Chloe is a stark and powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the ultimate violation of human trust. It challenges the deeply ingrained social narrative that blood relations automatically guarantee safety, loyalty, and unconditional love in a harsh world. It forces us to acknowledge that sometimes the most important survival mechanism we possess is the willingness to look at the people we love without the blinding filter of affection. Evelyn survived the complete dismantling of her life because she possessed a core strength that no amount of financial theft or psychological manipulation could ever truly touch. She stands today not as a victim of a devastating family crime, but as a self-made survivor who reclaimed her identity, her security, and her future on her own terms. If you find this story interesting, I will urge you to subscribe to this channel, hit the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video, like and drop your thought in the comment section. We read every one of them. We have upcoming videos. See you in the next one.